Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for today's webinar, Designing for Barrier-Free Access and Inclusivity. My name is Claire Hepburn, and I'm the Deputy Registrar at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I'd like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. To maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participants' microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window. So please feel free to submit any questions you might have for our speaker today. These will be addressed in the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And also note the chat function is deactivated following the introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please allow us a few weeks for processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we have provided automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. Now, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's session. Please welcome Megan Nicoletti.
Thank you, Claire. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for participating in my webinar today. I'm very excited about this topic and designing for barrier-free. For those of you that don't know me, I am Megan Nicoletti, and I operate a code consulting firm. I am located in Toronto, but we also have an office out on our Atlantic provinces in Moncton. We offer fire and life safety services, but we also focus on accessibility, which is the theme for today's topic. Even though you know me as your code consultant, though, I've brought in this topic a little bit larger to accommodate for additional discussion to have everybody have a better understanding of what barrier-free access and inclusivity really is. So if you were hoping for an hour-long presentation on code technical requirements, I'm sorry, I'm not going to bore you with that today. I'm going to educate you more on how we're going to approach these spaces and approach these designs. And if you understand the fundamentals of barrier-free access and inclusivity, it's going to make reading these code requirements a lot easier. So I do have some technical requirements in this presentation. Obviously, as a code consultant, I need to do so. But I want to enlighten you on what these requirements are and give you those foundational requirements. So today, we're going to be going through and going to define barrier-free, what it really means and what inclusivity really means. And then I'm going to speak to all those different regulations and standards that are out there. And I'm sure we've heard all the different terms beyond the OBC. And then I'm going to get in some of the technical requirements. And these are mostly questions that I see day to day from people such as yourselves, and where there's a little bit of lack of clarity. And I want to kind of educate you on those requirements. And then I'm going to go outside the boundaries of all these codes and standards, and I'm going to speak more to inclusive design and how we can make our spaces better and more accommodating for everybody. And then at the end, we'll have some time for some questions. As Claire stated, we're going to use the Q&A feature. So please put your questions in there as we go through, and then I will go through them all at the end. And hopefully we have time to get through all of them. So let's begin. What is barrier-free? So let's think about the wording, barrier-free. Okay? Oftentimes we think that people think of barrier-free design as a person in a wheelchair. Okay. But if you think of those barriers, then that does suit that name. So barriers are essentially things such as a curb or a doorway threshold or a stair. These are barriers that you're going to encounter as you move through a space, right? Even things beyond that, beyond the physical structure of our buildings. If we locate a cabinet in a corridor and it creates this pinch point, then that could become a barrier. So when we're designing to be barrier free, we want to take those barriers away to allow people to navigate through that space fully. Okay. And again, I speak to barrier free beyond the point of a person using a wheelchair. There's other people that you may need to consider. And this is often, I find, where the gap is because people don't necessarily accommodate for everybody's needs. So, some different situations, we have people who may use a white cane. We want to make sure that we accommodate for everyone. Alternatively, we may have someone who uses a walker. Someone in a walker could potentially navigate through a threshold of a doorway, and if there's a curb, it may not be too cumbersome for them. We also have to think beyond that. We have people with a service animal. Someone with a service animal may be better suited, accommodated within a corridor that may have a wider width. I recently broke my leg, and now I can personally relate to this one. Someone with crutches. I could navigate up and down stairs with crutches, but those narrow stairs were harder because I needed a wider path of travel. And for any of you who have children and you've tried to use a stroller navigating through some of our spaces, we're really dependent on those elevators and those lifts. And staircases are not easy to carry a stroller up and down. So these are all the people that we're trying to accommodate when we think of barrier free. Okay. So let's think beyond the person in a wheelchair and let's think about the needs of everybody. And everyone can benefit from a more accessible design. So now that we understand what barrier-free really means, I want to get into some of the nomenclature that we use in the industry because I hear some of these words and, they're not really how we want to address these people. And we want to create or remove the labels, right? You'll hear me use some of these words interchangeably, and all these words have different meanings, but we want to make sure that we accommodate people and we don't label them. So handicap is not a word that we want to use. A disabled person is not a word that we want to use. These are labels that we're putting on people, and we don't want to label people. So we want to interchange those with better language, and we want to start using the word accessible or person using a device. A person using a device is not necessarily a label to that person. They're still a person, okay? And through that, we have barrier-free and inclusive design. And these have different meanings. So barrier-free, it relates more to our built environment and those physical barriers that I just spoke to, like your door thresholds, your narrow corridors. Whereas inclusive design refers more to the accommodations and creating an environment that's welcoming to all. Okay? So barrier-free and inclusive design are different elements, and be mindful of your language choices as you move forward. I also want to have you have a better understanding of what our goals are when we're defining what barrier free is and what our intentions. We really want to support dignity and independent actions for all. So, to give an example of that, we want if an able bodied person can navigate through a space without asking for assistance, so should a person who uses a white cane or someone in a wheelchair. So we want to make sure that, say, for example, in a pool where we have a pool lift, it's great that we provide a lift, but if someone needs to ask for assistance to use that lift, they've lost their independence. And that's not the intention of this. Okay, so we want to ensure that if you can use a door, a path, a lift, an elevator independently without assistance, then this facility should provide accommodations for all. Okay. And as I stated in my last slide, we don't want to just consider that person using a wheelchair. We want to consider varying capabilities. And that includes dexterity, how we can actually use our fingers, assuming we have fingers, and what strengths we have. I often use the example of operating a door, that if a small child can operate a door or grandma can operate a door, they have different strengths than someone who may be in their 30s or 40s. And we want to make sure that we accommodate for everyone. The best way to do so is put yourself in this position. Could you do this? If you broke your arm and you could not, tighten your grasp, could you be able to operate that door with your broken arm? And that's what the intention of the codes and standards are, is to promote this access for everyone. And be mindful that the codes, acts, and standards, these are just our minimum design requirements, okay? You can go beyond these, and that's where I'm hoping to educate you on what you can do to better promote these spaces, okay? I'm going to give you another example because I like analogies and examples. I find they best bring this to your attention. But if we have an office and it's not served by an elevator, okay, so we have, say, a 2-story office, it's just a general office, and the upper floor level is not accessible. Per the codes and standards, it's not required that you make that space accessible. There is also language in our building code that says you do not need to provide an accessible path of travel on a certain floor space, provided that that same area and amenity can be provided elsewhere in the building. But we have to think beyond that, okay? So if we have a ground floor level office space that is fully accessible, but the upper level, say mezzanine or second floor, is not, and our codes are not retroactive, so we don't have to upgrade it. But if the entire accounting department of this office facility is located on the second floor, but you hire someone who uses a wheelchair and they cannot sit with their peers and they have to sit on the ground floor level, that does not promote the same level of dignity that we would accommodate for anybody who is able-bodied, right? We want people to be able to sit with their peers, work amongst their peers, right? We'll get this often for, say, cafeteria spaces where they say, okay, well, the cafeteria is on the second floor, but we can't accommodate someone in a wheelchair on the second floor, so we're going to put a little small kitchenette down on the lower level. Well, that means that person has to have lunch by themselves, right? And so there's a bit of discrimination there, and we want to be mindful of that, and we want to promote that everybody has the same environment. Okay, so think beyond the box a little bit and try and put yourself in their position, because that'll help you better understand how we can apply the codes and standards to our spaces. So now let's get into some of the technical requirements. Oh, sorry, regulations and standards. I'm jumping ahead here. So let's go through some of the regulations and standards, and I'm sure you've come across these in your designs, but I want to give some clarity because we often get asked which code applies, which standard applies, which one trumps that. So I'm going to go through some of the key regulations and standards that we see in our industry. So first of all, we all know the building code. We have our provincial codes and we have our national codes, and they both outline barrier-free requirements and how to design our buildings. We also have the Accessibility for Ontarians Disability Act, that's your AODA, which we're all aware of. We also have CSA B651, which is a standard, and it's the accessible design for the built environment. You'll hear a reference to that quite often. And then we have our municipal barrier-free design guidelines. So each local jurisdiction may draft and have out their own barrier-free design guidelines that we follow. These are typically more involved than what we would expect in the building code. And then we have our owner-operator standards. So let me expand on what each of those is and what regulations they provide. So our building codes are quite simple in terms of barrier-free design. They provide you with the basic design requirements, and they're going to cover kind of navigating through the general spaces of our building. There are some details with respect to washrooms and controls, but they are pretty basic in terms of how we design our spaces to be accessible, okay? It's not a comprehensive list, and there's often a lot of gaps. Building code is our first tier of maintaining a minimum level of compliance, okay? So if you follow the building code, you are compliant, but there's a lot of areas that we can improve upon this. Again, the building codes provide not a lot of detail in terms of barrier-free access. Which brings us to some of our other codes. AODA. So this was first introduced in 2005. It has an enforcement date coming up fast and furious as of January 1st. And I remember when this document was first published, there was a lot of panic in the industry because everybody had to bring their buildings up to meet these design requirements. I actually sat on a committee that was tasked to evaluate how the AODA worked with the building code. Were there any conflicts? And when it was first published, there were many conflicts. All of our corridor widths were significantly increased beyond the width of the standard building code corridor widths. So I was tasked to do an evaluation of which requirements conflicted with the building code and the cost implications of enforcing some of those first proposed requirements under AODA. And what they found was these conflicts were a little bit confusing. Why were we writing this twice? We had the barrier-free requirements in the building code. We didn't need to duplicate our efforts under AODA. So AODA pulled back and they removed a lot of the interior space requirements from that standard. And what they did was they developed 3 separate standards. So I think it's transportation, I can't remember the name of the third one, and the design of public spaces standard. And what the intention here is that the building code is going to govern all the interior spaces of our building, whether private or public, but AODA was going to address the public spaces within and around our building. Remember, our building code governs the building internally and lead kind of the areas around the perimeter of the building, allowing access to the building. However, AODA goes one step farther, and it's actually even governing our exterior spaces. So if you have park benches, exterior amenity areas, pathways, trails, playgrounds, all of those are governed under AODA, and the Ontario Building Code is silent on. Okay. If you have public spaces within your building, then they will follow the requirements under AODA. And be mindful of the language, public spaces, okay? So just when you're trying to determine whether you have a public space, think, can anybody off the street walk in and use this washroom, use this lobby without having key card access or being stopped for security to find out why they're in this space, okay? So these are publicly accessible spaces. So the intention is AODA is going to govern those public and exterior spaces, while the interior spaces still fall under the building code, okay? You'll hear me refer to AODA in terms of the DOPS standard. So that's the Design of Public Spaces standard. This is the one that's most relevant to our line of work, and those are the prescriptive requirements governing our buildings. So we speak mostly to the DOPS standard. In addition to AODA, we also have our CSA standard. So you're probably familiar with this standard through the NBC. So the National Building Code of Canada enforces this document, and it gives you the option. You can either comply with the barrier-free requirements of the NBC, or you can adopt the requirements of CSA B651. So this is a standard. It's actually a really good standard. If you aren't sure of how to apply a requirement, or you're looking for a graphical representation of one of the requirements, I suggest that you look to CSA B651 because it's a really good document for that. But note that the CSA standard is not enforced in Ontario. So in our Ontario Building Code, under Part 1, we have what's called our reference standards, and those are the only documents that Ontario mandates you comply with, okay? CSA B651 is not a reference standard in Ontario, so it is not enforceable. But that isn't to say that you can't use it as good practice. Okay, like I said, there's a lot of gaps in our Ontario Building Code. So if you want to go beyond those requirements and use CSA B651 requirements, nobody is going to hold that against you. That is good practice. Okay, so CSA is enforced under the National Building Code, but not the Ontario Building Code. But we often recommend that you use it for lack of other prescriptive requirements that are not identified in the building code. In addition to BSA 651, we have a lot of local municipal design guidelines. So some jurisdictions may adopt these guidelines through municipal policy and enforce them under a bylaw, okay? There's very different jurisdictions that have them. Windsor, Vaughan, Toronto, Ottawa, London, Chatham-Kent, Hamilton, Mississauga, Welland, they've all adopted their own barrier-free design guidelines, okay? They are enforceable. I've given you a screenshot here of what Hamilton accessibility design guidelines look like. They're very comprehensive. They typically are modeled after CSA B651 requirements. They often include graphical representation, but they do have a lot more requirements that you would find in our building code, okay? So these are our municipal design guidelines. I suggest if you are doing a project in every jurisdiction, you do kind of a quick Google search to find out if that local jurisdiction does have their own design guidelines and if they enforce them. So in addition to our municipal design guidelines, we also have kind of owner-operator design guidelines. I know that Infrastructure Ontario has their own guidelines for barrier-free design. Multiple universities and colleges, U of T, TMU, they all have their own design guidelines that they require for all of their projects. There was also a recent CSA B652 that was brought out just relatively recently to address accessible dwelling units. And we have our integrated accessibility standards regulations, and we also have ADA requirements. So these are all documents that you may have for your project that are enforced for that specific project, but those are driven by the owner and operator. So there's no bylaw that's enforcing them. These are owner-driven standards. And I want to draw your attention to that final bullet there, that ADA. We often hear this language. We often see drawings that have ADA language on them. This is the Americans with Disability Act. This is not enforceable in Canada. And these dimensions do not necessarily align with our Canadian standards. So we don't want to be seeing any reference to ADA requirements. We want to see references to our Canadian standards. Okay. ADA is not enforceable in Canada, and be mindful of those dimensions because they are different. So speaking to enforcement, we often get asked which document trumps which, when do I have to follow certain documents? So we always start with the Ontario Building Code, okay? The Ontario Building Code and AODA, they're both adopted under respective acts, so they're both enforceable. And like I said, there were specific task groups assigned to make sure that there aren't any conflicts. So you shouldn't anticipate any conflicts between the Ontario Building Code and the AODA because essentially they're governing different spaces, okay? CFA B651, although it's not enforced in Ontario, these are all just good practice requirements, but if you adopt them under the NBC, then they would be enforced under the building code, okay? They would be enforced for the National Building Code requirement. Those would be the ultimate trumping requirement if you adopted the CSA standards. From an Ontario perspective, if you're an Ontario Building Code regulated project, then CSA is just good practice. So you either choose to follow it or not. There is a requirement under the Building Code Act, under Section 35, that says that the building code will supersede all municipal bylaws that conflict. Okay, so if you follow a Hamilton accessibility design guideline requirement that says your corridor must be 1,300 millimeters wide, but the Ontario Building Code says your corridor is only required to be 1,100, the building code will supersede that requirement. Okay, whether it's more conservative or less conservative. Continuing on, now we're going to get into some of the technical requirements. So through this, I'm going to be covering part 11, how we are designed for barrier-free in some of our existing buildings. I'm going to go through barrier-free path of travel and cover kind of doors, corridors, ramps, and entrances. I'm going to speak to parking. This is driven from AODA requirements, but I thought it would be helpful to include some slides to give you some examples of that. We're going to speak to how we allocate our Group C suites or residential applications and how we design for accessible suites, and then washrooms. We always get 1,000 questions on washrooms, so I thought I would give you some language to help support you in interpreting those requirements. So let's start in here with part 11. There is an article on part 11. So part 11, for those that don't know, is our renovation section of the building code. It is applicable to buildings that have been in existence for at least 5 years, okay? It governs under Article 332, new construction within an existing building is required to conform with OBC Section 3.8. This is the article that's relative to barrier-free for existing buildings, okay? This falls under extensive renovation. So you have your existing building, and if you're extensively renovating it, i.e. you're building walls or floors, that would be considered new construction. And you need to design that space to be barrier-free where you comply with each of the 3 bullets that I've listed. This is a direct reference from the building code. And there is that conjunction of and. I've highlighted it because this is important. You need to comply with each of these requirements to design that new space that you're renovating to be barrier-free accessible. So if you're installing new interior walls or floors, say check, yes we are, then you need to be designed to be barrier-free per the first bullet. The second one, your suite has an area greater than 300 meters squared. If it does, you're still barrier-free. If your suite is less than 300 meters squared, well, let's pause on that. You don't hit the second bullet, and I'll get to that on the next slide. And then the third bullet is essentially saying that if your suite is located at grade, where there's no transition over a curb or a threshold that's more than 200 meters, then you would comply with that. Or if your floor level is served by an elevator. So noting that and conjunction, if your construction complies with all three of those requirements, then you need to be barrier-free. However, if you don't comply with any one of those requirements, then you do not need to design your suite to be fully barrier-free accessible. So as I alluded to before, if your suite has an area less than 300 meters squared, you do not need to design per the requirements of section 3.8 to be barrier-free accessible. Okay? However, there's a caveat. Don't get off that lightly. There are some other requirements that we still need to consider. So under OBC sentence 11332, sentence 3, there are specific requirements that say, even though we're not designing this space to be fully accessible, we're still looking to incorporate some of the barrier-free requirements that are going to benefit people who can utilize a larger corridor space. And like I said in that first slide there, it's people who may use a white cane who can still navigate stairs, or people who rely on braille, tactile signage. Those are the requirements that we want to adopt through these spaces. And we call these kind of our limited barrier-free requirements. So even though our suite or our floor area is exempt per that previous article, because say we were less than 300 meters squared, we still need to adopt these requirements. And the building code is very specific, and it speaks to interior walking surfaces. So these are kind of our corridors and ensuring we don't have any tripping hazards. Washrooms still need to be designed to be barrier-free, but there are very specific references and to what extent. And we're looking for ambulatory washrooms in this circumstance. Tactile signage, like I said, someone with a white cane can still navigate up a staircase and would benefit from having some tactile signage throughout that floor. Doors, perhaps someone has a service animal and they've navigated up the stair and they want to navigate through that doorway. They're going to benefit from that widened doorway when they have a service animal beside them. So we want to look at doors, assistive lifting devices, counters for telephones, and drinking fountains. So these are all those kind of limited barrier-free requirements that are still required throughout your renovated floor area, even though you don't have to comply with the full barrier-free requirements of subsection 3.8. Okay, so I wanted to emphasize that, but let's give an example here. I want to give an example because this is where the code gets fun. So there is a requirement under 11321 that speaks to additions. Okay, so we have our existing building and we're going to put an addition on that building. Whether we put the addition on the top or we punch out to the side and we increase the footprint of our building, we have an addition on the back per se. This requirement says where an existing building is extended, Part 11 applies to the existing building. So the existing building is governed by Part 11. It's essentially grandfathered. But the extended portion of the building must comply with all other parts. So if you think about that, the extension, the addition, whether it be on top or out back, must comply with all parts. We cannot apply Part 11 to that new addition that's being constructed, which means, going backwards here, we cannot apply this requirement under OBC Article 332 because this is a Part 11 requirement that's going to exempt you from barrier-free. And this article is not applicable to a new addition. So if we don't have that exemption, that new addition has to be designed to be fully barrier-free. What does that mean? Well, that means that even though we were not, say, touching the entrance to our building, and our entrance has, say, a curb or a threshold leading up to it, we will need to modify that entrance to allow for a barrier-free path of travel to reach our addition. That may not be so consequential if our addition is kind of a bump out on the back, but if we're putting a whole new story on, that means we also have to install an elevator, okay? That elevator, we have to provide access to that new floor area under all other parts. We need a fully barrier-free accessible floor area as new construction. So we would have to modify our entrance, modify our corridors, potentially install an elevator, and have that elevator serve that new story. However, this is where our code gets a little bit wonky, and I don't recommend this because it's not good practice, but technically, per the language of the code, that elevator only needs to serve that new construction, that new story. So if you look at my little graphic here, we're putting a 5th story addition on. The elevator only has to have floor level 5. It's not necessary that that elevator stop on levels 2, 3, or 4 because those are the existing building. They're governed under Part 11 and they are potentially exempt from a barrier-free path of travel. The OBC is also not retroactive, so we're not required to upgrade that existing building. Okay. So the city cannot enforce you to have your elevator stop on those floors, but it would be good practice to allow for us, considering we want to create these inclusive spaces. Maybe our accounting department is located on level 2, and we don't want to have someone not be able to sit with their peers. But that being said, where do you draw the line in the sand? You've got your elevator serving that floor, but then they can't navigate through that floor level. We don't have doors that are wide enough. Building code is not retroactive. We're not obligated to widen any of those doors. So eventually we will have to draw the line in that sand, but the extent of the code application is that we only have that barrier-free path of travel serve that new story or that new addition. Okay. So that's a little bit nuanced there, and I want you to be mindful of that. Pay particular attention to OBC Article 11321. The existing building is governed by Part 11, but new construction and extended portions have to fall under all other parts. And that means fully complying with OBC Section 3.8. One of the few circumstances in the building code where we actually have to upgrade the existing building. Okay, so we've covered Part 11. So let's get into some of the barrier-free path of travel requirements. So how we're going to navigate through our spaces. So under the new OBC, so we have a new building code, Ontario Building Code, coming out in January. So I've tried to stay current here. So these requirements are reflective of the 2024 Ontario Building Code. Do not take these requirements to heart if you are designing currently within the next 2 weeks under the 2012 Ontario Building Code. Okay, so these references are with respect to the new code coming out. And under the new OBC, every entrance to your building needs to be designed to be barrier-free accessible. Okay, so that being said, you want to be mindful that that's not just our doors. So our doors need the international symbol of access on them as an entrance door. They need a power door operator. But also be mindful of all those exterior pathways that are leading up to these doors and connections to parking areas. These also need to be designed to be barrier-free, and those connections to parking areas are also going to trigger requirements for AODA for parking, which I will get to in a few slides. So under barrier-free path of travel, every entrance to our building needs to be barrier-free. That's a big change from the 2012, which was only proportionally requiring our entrances to be designed to be barrier-free. We've also changed the clear door width for barrier-free path of travel. Under Ontario 2012, we were 860, but we have harmonized with the National Building Code and all other provinces, and we require an 850 clear door width. And I want to provide some a little bit more clarification on this. I've actually got a graphic that I'm going to flip to that's going to explain this. What is clear width? Okay, clear width often gets misinterpreted as the width of the door panel, and that's not correct. Clear width, and especially from a perspective of barrier-free, this is how someone can navigate through this doorway threshold. So we want to ensure that we have sufficient width that we can accommodate everybody moving through this space. So in our line or in our conventional designs, we currently in Ontario require an 860 clear door width. That standard, or that translates to a standard 965 millimeter door, or if anybody's still using imperial dimensions, that's a 38-inch door. That 38-inch door, 965 millimeter door, will provide you with sufficient clear width. We are now moving under the 2024 code to a 850 clear width. And that 850 clear width can be achieved by a standard 915 or a 36-inch typical door panel. Okay. Our clear width is measured from the face of the stop on the door side, on the latch side, to the face of the door hardware. And this is often misinterpreted. People often measure it to the face of the door panel. When it comes to barrier-free, we can't have any door handles or any door hardware or any door trim impeding into this clear width, because if it impedes to the width, it may actually inhibit someone from navigating through this space. So we do not account, or we have to account for our door hardware, and we measure to the face of our door hardware, okay? There is some language in the code that says that, or in the past used to say that door hardware could impede, or was interpreted that door hardware could impede onto the clear width. And that was okay for an exit width when we were determining our flow rates through a door, but that does not relate when it comes to barrier-free access, okay? That door hardware could impede that path of travel, and that's not the intention. So again, when we're measuring clear width, we're measuring from the face of the stop to the edge of the door hardware, the literal clear width within that doorway. There are different requirements that I want you to be aware of. We also have down in the code, there's a requirement that our corridors have to be wide enough to allow for people to pass. So if we have two people walking down a corridor, they're approaching each other and they both have a service animal, we don't expect that someone has to pin themselves up against a wall to allow the next person to navigate. So we understand that people can sidestep or back up or pause at a kind of a widened area, but we want to make sure that those widened areas are located every 30 meters to allow for people to pass. We don't want to have someone walk back unnecessarily in the wrong direction for too far. So we want to have those widened areas to allow for people to pass each other. This is only applicable if your corridor is less than 1,600 millimeters wide. And note that the standard corridor in a barrier-free path of travel is 1,100. Okay, so typically we'll see those 1,100 millimeter wide corridors, and we want to provide those passing areas every 30 meters. If our corridors as a whole are generally 1,600 or more meters wide, which we do see, then you do not need to worry about these passing areas. Okay. These passing areas will have a minimum dimension of 1,800 by 1,800, and we often see them get incorporated into the designs, and they'll use, say, the elevator lobby. The elevator lobby on a corridor, if it's centralized, often is within 30 meters of an end of a corridor, and that can provide that sufficient passing area. I do want to draw your attention, though, that CSA B651 does reduce this passing area. So where our building codes allow every 30 meters we need a passing area, CSA B651 drops that down to 24 meters. And so we need those passing areas every 24 meters. So if you're an NBC regulated building or you're adopting them as good practice, you want to look at that shortened distance for those passing areas. Another requirement that we often get a lot of confusion on is ramps. Ramps under the new code, they must be designed at a slope of 1 in 12, okay? This pitch is considered sufficient for someone to navigate up, and they can pull on both handrails if they're using a wheelchair. They can navigate up this without too much effort. Under the new building code, we've widened our ramps. They are now required to be at least 1 meter wide, and this is measured from the inside handrail to the inside of the handrail. And these dimensions, again, are to make sure that someone can reach those handles or handrails and make sure that they can pull themselves up this ramp with sufficient space. There's also a requirement that we have level resting areas, right? It can be quite arduous to pull yourself up a ramp that is, 10 meters long, 20 meters long, when you're relying on both your arms. So we want to have those resting areas to give people a little bit of breather space to navigate the rest of the ramp. There's also a requirement that we have handrails on both sides, noting that if you have a conventional width, you only need to require them on both sides. But if your dimension is more than 2,200 millimeters wide, you're going to need that intermediate handrail. Again, the idea is that someone can grasp a handrail on both sides and pull themselves up if they require the use of a wheelchair. And we also want to ensure that we have a wall or a guard on both sides of our ramp so that we prevent people from kind of tripping or falling off the edge of our ramps, right? Someone who has a vision impairment and uses a white cane, they may want to have something that's cane detectable, right, on the side of that ramp so they understand those transitional differences. I was on site and I grabbed a great photograph that I think will give you a really good example and allow you to be aware of what we need to consider. So I have this building entrance. This was our accessible entrance to the building. It had a very long ramp that led up to the entrance door. It all looks good. We did notice, though, that the access to this building was controlled by a card reader. I apologize if the photo is quite small, but if you notice just to the right of the door, there is a small black box. That is a card reader. That card reader was actually located on the slope of the ramp. So let's think of a person who uses a wheelchair. They're going to be navigating up. There's no handrail on the other side of this, on the wall side. So they're navigating up with their left hand. Let's hope they're left-handed. They're pulling themselves up, wheeling themselves up this ramp. Then they have to pause on the slope, reach into their pocket, purse, bag, achieve their card or find their card, access card, swipe their card while still holding their wheelchair in a stable position on a slope that's going to send them down the ramp backwards. Tap their card, put their card away so they can then navigate their wheelchair to the door, up the slope to the level area, open the door, and hope that they can do that all in the time that that card reader remains active. So clearly this is not a good example of barrier-free. This can be quite difficult for anybody, even if you're able-bodied, to navigate through that card access reader into that doorway space. Okay, so we want to have those level areas at the top of our ramp, and we want to locate our control devices such that they're accessible and not locate them on the slopes of our ramps. So let's move on into parking. So under the Ontario Building Code, we really only govern the access routes and the exterior walkways of our building. And we want to ensure that if we provide parking on a parking level, that there's a connection between our building and our parking areas. That's really the extent of the building code application to our parking spaces. However, AODA, they are the guiding standard on how many parking spaces you need to provide from an accessible standpoint, and what type they need to be. And type, we have type A, which is a van parking space, and we have type B, which is a conventional car size space. And how we design those access routes between those parking spaces. So I've put in this graphic. This graphic was taken from Infrastructure Ontario on their guidelines, but it represents how we are to be designing our spaces, okay? We often will have both a type A and a type B. By default, we want to have that van space because that's going to be more inclusive and accommodate for everybody, but it is proportional to the number of stalls that you do provide. So if you're looking to see how many accessible parking spaces you need and you want some graphics to represent that, then AODA standard is the one that's governing this requirement for parking space. And again, remember, exterior spaces are governed by AODA. I also want to get into some of the language around accessible parking spaces because you're going to hear a lot of these terms, but they don't necessarily translate into what we're looking at. So you'll hear me speak to access aisles, and you'll read this. An access aisle is the space between your parked vehicles, okay? So the intention here is someone is going to bring their vehicle up. They're going to park in either the type A van space or the conventional car space. But if it's a van, you have a sliding door on the side. Okay, so we want to make sure that someone who is using a wheelchair can actually navigate out that van door and walk up between the car spaces. If we didn't have this access aisle, then the car next door, the next parked car, may be parked too close, and then that person using that van door would not be able to exit. Okay, so we want to ensure that we have this access aisle between our parked spaces. It can be shared between two vehicles. It can be on both sides. That's at your discretion. But again, this is your minimum that we provide it on one side only. But be mindful that if your parking spot's full and they have to take the next spot, well, maybe they don't have a door on that side that will allow them to access that access aisle. So they have to reverse in. And that might pose some difficulties as well. So ideally, we want to see these access aisles located on both sides of the vehicle. But again, that's an ideal situation and your space may not warrant that. But that's just something we can be mindful of when we're designing our spaces to be fully inclusive. We've also got the requirement for passenger loading zones. Okay, so these are where your Uber is going to be dropping you off at a building or a bus is going to be pulling up. So these passenger loading zones really are these curb cuts that transition from a roadway to the building entrance or to the sidewalk that's serving the building entrance. And there's very prescriptive requirements that are going to allow a vehicle to pull up, someone to navigate out of the vehicle, and then to navigate that curb threshold up to reach the sidewalk or the exterior pathway system serving the building. So there are prescriptive requirements for passenger loading zones. There are no requirements that state when you need them. It's just if you provide them, these are how we design too, okay? You'll also read some language on curb ramps. Curb ramps are also covered in the Ontario Building Code, and these are often in our exterior pathways that are going to allow access throughout our spaces. And we have curb ramps and curb cuts. I've put a graphic there, but this is essentially where we are going to depress a section of the curb to allow for an easy transition between the roadway and even sometimes just exterior pathways to compensate for those transitional changes. Okay, so we can adopt a curb ramp. These are not your conventional ramps. We don't need handrails or guards around these spaces. They're usually pretty minor in terms of that elevational change. And we want to make sure that we have tactile attention indicators. So tactile attention indicators, the best way to think of when you need them is if there is a hazard that someone could potentially misstep and have a tripping hazard, we want to put these tactile attention indicators. You'll notice that the building code does not require tactile attention indicators at the top of ramps. The reason being is that you can, through your footfall, you can detect that there is a slope change on a ramp as you navigate across. However, if we think in terms of a stair, you may step down and not realize that there's a slope change, and that could create a fall. So we want to see those tactile attention indicators where there is an elevational change that could cause someone to trip or fall. Okay. What are our tactile attention indicators? It's a big word, but these are those yellow truncated domes that we see. Anybody from Toronto will see them on the subway at the platform edge, right? We want to allow people to be aware through foot that they can sense that there's going to be a risk on the other side of that tactile. Okay. So it's detectable by cane, it's detectable by tread, and these are those yellow truncated domes. I've put a photo in the top right, but those are called tactile attention indicators. We want to draw the attention of someone who may have a vision impairment that there is a risk or a hazard on the other side of it. Okay. There are very prescriptive requirements, I believe, in CSA B651, as well as some of the owner-operator standards. I know, has very specific detailing on the size of those truncated domes and the spacing of them. So there are very prescriptive requirements in any of these codes and standards that I've referenced that if you need to, you can design to. Moving on to accessible group C suites. So there is a requirement in the building code that if you are designing a residential building, when I say residential building, I'm not just specific to apartment buildings, but this is also applicable to hotels. But there is a requirement that we have to provide suites that can be accommodated by all. So we have to have a certain number of accessible suites. Okay. Under the building code, it's required that we have at least 15% of our residential suites be designed to be barrier-free accessible. And what that means is that we have to provide a path of travel from the entrance door to that unit to at least one bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen area, a living space. Okay, that's all that's mandated by the code. So if you have a 3-bedroom suite, only one bedroom in that accessible suite needs to be designed to be accessible. The other 2 bedrooms do not. Now, this is one of those gaps in the code that I really highly recommend that we design to be fully inclusive. If you imagine that you use a wheelchair and that you are navigating through your own apartment, but you can only go into one bedroom. You have a guest visit. You can't go into that bedroom and make that bed for them because that space is not designed to be accessible. If this is your own unit, you want to make sure that you can navigate your unit fully. So even though you're only required to extend your barrier-free path of travel through single rooms within your space, it's good practice to make sure that we can design that suite to be fully accessible. We also have to be mindful of how we distribute our accessible suites. And oftentimes we'll see people who come in and say, okay, our design, we need, we have 100 suites in our building, of which we need 15 of them to be designed to be barrier-free accessible. So we're going to put them all on the ground floor. But that's a bit discriminatory because we want to make sure that we afford them the same views and the same sight lines that would be achieved of having, say, a penthouse suite, right? So we want to make sure that we distribute those suites, those barrier-free suites, throughout the full height of the building. You've also got to be mindful of cost, right? If you were looking to buy, say, a condo, the ground floor units may not have the same value that those upper condo units would have, right? And we don't want to say, well, I'm sorry you use a wheelchair, you can only have a ground floor condo, when maybe they want the high value suite up on the upper floor level. Or maybe from a different affordability standpoint, if we turn that analogy upside down and we say, well, okay, we are locating all of our accessible suites on the 20th floor. And, they may not have that same cost implication that those ground level suites are. So we want to make sure that we distribute throughout the height of the building. The code does not describe exactly how we distribute them, but just be mindful that we want to afford the same level of options that we would to somebody who doesn't need an accessible suite. So locating them throughout the low levels, the high levels, and the mid levels would be a good design. We also have to be mindful of distribution with respect to different suite types. All right. So oftentimes we won't have a building that's going to have all 1-bedroom suites. There's going to be some 2-bedroom suites and some 3-bedroom suites and plus den or without den. So we want to make sure that we distribute that 15% against all different suite types. Okay. So even though you have, say, 100 suites, you require 15 suites to be accessible, of which maybe 7 are designed as 1-bedroom, 2 are designed as 3-bedroom, proportionally 15% to those quantities. Okay. So if we have, 10 1-bedroom suites, well, then one of them would be designed to be barrier-free accessible. If we have 50 2-bedroom suites, then we're going to want to design, that can be 7 to be barrier-free accessible. So we want to make sure that we distribute across those different unit types. However, I will say that we don't need to get into the minutia. We don't need to worry about those 1-bedroom plus den, 2-bedroom plus den. We would just treat those as 1-bedroom suites. So a 1-bedroom suite could be the total number of your 1-bedroom and your 1-bedroom plus den. Those are all 1-bedroom units, and we want to make sure that we distribute our suite types throughout that. Okay. We want to, again, like I said, for the full height of the building, we want to make sure that we offer the same opportunity to everybody. Okay. So that's how we design our barrier-free suites. I've put some graphics here as well that are taken from the appendix and show how we design our, can I put this one? Oh, residential bathrooms. Some of the requirements that we need to consider for residential bathrooms. They need to have that turning space. And again, only 1 bathroom in our suite is required to be accessible, but it would be good practice to design all of our bathrooms in an accessible suite to be barrier-free. Moving on, let's get into washrooms. Washrooms are probably the biggest conundrum for designers with respect to how to design to be barrier-free. And you hear all different terminology from universal washrooms, ambulatory washrooms, water closets. So instead of getting into the kind of the technical requirements on how to locate your grab bars and those details, I thought if I just explained to you the different washroom types and how we consider them, then I thought that might be more beneficial in terms of providing the prescriptive code requirements. And once you understand the language, you can go and read those OBC requirements or accessible requirements and apply the appropriate design to those respective washrooms. Universal washrooms. So these are our big washrooms. I hear a lot of complaints about these big washrooms due to their size, but the OBC does define what a universal washroom is and how many we need to locate in our building. Okay. The number of universal washrooms. So these are very large washrooms. These are the ones that have that adult size change table in them potentially. These universal washrooms, there is a table in the OBC, table 3823, that defines how many universal washrooms are needed. And it's based on the number of stories in your building. Okay, so if you have a 3-story building, you only need 1 universal washroom. If you have many stories in your building, you may need 2 or 3 universal washrooms in your building. But I want to draw your attention that the building code does not stipulate where washrooms need to be located in a building. So in this circumstance, you could locate all of your required number of universal washrooms on 1 single floor level. It's not necessary that we distribute these throughout the full height of the building, and they can be located all in the basement if you choose. But again, we want to think of the dignity and the independence of a user who's operating these washrooms. We want to ensure that they're not having to go out of their way to reach these washrooms. So even though the code allows us to locate them all in the basement of the building, we want to be mindful of that when we're designing out our spaces and maybe locate them to be in a better, more convenient location. From a residential application, where we have multiple residential units located on every floor, and maybe we have a single amenity floor. In terms of applying this table to determine how many universal washrooms are required, we need not concern ourselves with the residential floor levels, where they're typically only residential suites. And there's an appendix note to the building code that covers this. We can remove that. So we may have a 30-floor condo tower that has, say, 2 levels of amenity. We don't need to consider those full 30 floors when we're applying table 3823 to determine how many universal washrooms we need. We need only worry about those amenity floors. So we have 2 amenity floors. Per that table, we would only require 1 universal washroom. And like I said before, we do not need to locate that universal washroom on the amenity floor, okay? And the idea behind that requirement and why we don't need to consider those residential floors is that we've already made accommodations through our accessible suites, right? So we don't need to worry about that. People have their own washrooms in their units, whether they're accessible or not, that have all the accommodations that they need. So we don't need to provide universal washrooms on top of those washrooms within those specific suite units. So we can take those floor levels out of that equation, okay? The number of water closets required to be barrier-free. So this is for our common washrooms. And again, I'll get to some of the language here, but we have our washroom, and our washroom can consist of multiple stalls, right? It can be a single stall or it can be multiple stalls. So our washroom is our washroom, okay? So if you think of it that way, washroom, it's our room that could have multiple water stalls in it. And there's a requirement under table 3823B that says if you're providing washroom stalls in a washroom, we shouldn't inconvenience anybody and have them go down the hall to use an accessible washroom down the hall. So if we're over a certain number of water closet stalls in a washroom, then we need to allow for a barrier-free water closet stall in that washroom. Okay, so if we have 4 stalls in a washroom, one of which will have to be designed to be barrier-free. Again, we want to make sure that we have access for all. The code does allow us, though, where we have our smaller washrooms, where we only have 3 stalls or less, you need not design those stalls to be accessible if you can prove that there's an accessible stall on the same floor level, because we don't want someone to have to travel to a different floor to use a washroom, on that same floor level within 45 meters, okay? So there is an allowance there for our smaller washrooms, but technically if we're proposing washrooms on a floor, we want to make sure that we make them accessible to all. There's also a requirement. The code is very specific in its language on washrooms that are required and washrooms that are provided in excess. So I hope everybody knows that when you have a floor level, washrooms aren't just arbitrarily chosen on how many we put into a floor level. These have to be determined, and there are tables under the OBC that says based on this use and based on the number of people, we need to have a certain number of water closets per floor, okay? That being said, a client or an operator may choose to have additional washrooms. They may only require 2 or 3, but maybe for sake of convenience, they want to put in additional washrooms throughout a floor. So now the question arises, if we provide those washrooms, even though they're voluntary, do they need to be barrier-free accessible? Yes, they do. We're providing them as an extra amenity, so why should we discriminate and make them exclusive to certain people, right? We want to ensure that those are accessible. And again, there is still that requirement, though, that if they're located in close proximity to another accessible water closet that is accessible to everybody, i.e. they're not secured, then we don't necessarily need to design them to be accessible. But we do need to consider barrier-free application to these additional washroom facilities. Okay. So I've got some examples on the next slide here that is going to walk through different washroom types that we see. And I've mentioned this ambulatory water closet stall. So this is one of those washroom stalls that when I spoke to part 11 that I said, even though your floor area is not designed to be barrier-free accessible, you hit those exemptions, you still need to consider washrooms because these are people who can still navigate stairways but could benefit from this washroom. So for example, someone in a walker may be able to navigate up a stair, and when they go to use the washroom, this ambulatory washroom would be quite helpful to them because it's very narrow and there's grab bars on both sides of the toilet, so they can lower themselves to that toilet space. And maybe they leave their walker out in the hall while they use this facility. So these are our ambulatory washrooms, and these are driven under Part 11, but they're also an allowable option for you for barrier-free. Noting that these are typically located in a floor area that's not necessarily served by a barrier-free path of travel. So these are very narrow washrooms. They're quite small because we want to ensure that someone sitting on a toilet has access to the grab bars on either side. Okay, so these are our ambulatory water closets. We have our universal washrooms. These are the big guys. These are the ones that take up a lot of our valuable floor space. But these are intended for full navigation for people who need to change in this space. We have our adult size change table. And note that the code requirement is not that we provide an adult size change table, but that we provide sufficient floor space for it. So it is a bit counterintuitive in the sense, because I'm not sure if someone would be bringing their own table, but it's for future provisions to allow for a table to be installed. So that means wall reinforcement and sufficient clear floor space. Note that not every building type requires that we have our universal washroom designed to accommodate an adult size change table. There are exemptions under the building code that don't require it. And I don't know the requirement fully off the top of my head, but I know that if your suite area, I believe, is less than 300 meters squared, you are exempt from that requirement for that adult size change table clear floor space. There are specific requirements when designing your universal washroom that we lay out our space to allow for transfer spaces and navigational elements throughout this washroom. So we want to make sure we can accommodate someone turning in this washroom and that they can transfer from the toilet over to the sink and that everything is within reach. And we also want to be mindful of, this is one of the typical questions I do get asked quite often, that turning space. Can that turning space overlap some of the equipment that's in this washroom? Well, if that sink is impeding onto that turning space, someone in a wheelchair may not be able to turn. Same with the toilet, right? If there's something that's mounted quite high, then perhaps someone could turn under that space. But we want to be mindful of kind of those headroom clearances. There is a graphic under the appendix to the Ontario Building Code that is very specific with respect to door swing. So a door swing can impede the turning circle. And if you look at that central graphic, you'll see that the door swing does show it an overlap over the door swing. That being said, the door panel, when open to the 90-degree, cannot impede onto that turning space. When the door is open fully 90 degrees, the door panel itself cannot impede onto that turning circle, okay? And again, I spoke to turning or the space for an adult size change table. It is just a space. We do not have a table installed. So for that reason, the turning circle can also overlap the adult size change table space. So these are our large universal washrooms. They are located where you wish in a building. They are dependent on the number of stories in your building and how we propose them. I will caveat, I've had a few projects where I'm doing a tenant fit out. Universal washrooms typically fall under base building design, but I've had a few tenant fit out projects where the existing building is not equipped with a universal washroom. The universal washrooms requirements and the provisions for adult size change table were brought in 2015, and they are not retrofit, so we don't need to upgrade our existing base building to comply with this universal washroom requirement. But that being said, I have had some jurisdictions enforce this deficit onto the first tenant that does renovations. So if you're doing a full tenant fit out and there is no universal washroom in the building, don't be surprised if the local authorities say, well, this building is deficient, it does not have a universal washroom. You need to propose it into your design, okay? Particularly if you are affecting any of the washrooms or adding washrooms. If you're adding a washroom, they may mandate that that washroom be universal. I do disagree with this in a little bit because I feel that a universal washroom should be accessible. If it's required for a building, it should be accessible to all occupants of the building. Again, its requirement is based on the number of stories in a building. So if we're going to bury it into a tenant suite, then it's really not accessible for all. It's only available for that tenant itself. So I don't know if it fulfills the mandate of the building code and the intent of the building code in that regard, but this is the city's interpretation often. So I just want you to be mindful of that when you're designing your spaces so there's no surprises. I also spoke to washroom stalls again, so we could have multiple stalls within a washroom, right? So if we have a certain number of stalls, then one of our stalls needs to be designed to be accessible. And there are very prescriptive requirements for our washroom stalls with respect to proximity to obstructions approaching the stall, the door swinging inwards and outwards, transfer space within that stall, turning circles, even locating the coat hook. There are very specific requirements that are governing the design of these washroom stalls. Okay. The other thing I do want to mention is that the building code has now, under the 2024 building code, it has now adopted all gender washrooms. There is simply an appendix note, so it's not in the body of the building code, but all gender washroom stalls. So typically what we see for in terms of all gender is that we have a grouping of individual washrooms. Sometimes they contain a toilet and a sink, or sometimes it's just a toilet with the sinks communally located out in the corridor. But these are all gender washroom stalls. And again, terminology. We hear many different variations of how we classify these spaces, but these are the terminology that we're currently using is all gender washroom stalls. We no longer say gender neutral. And all gender washroom stalls are allowed under the building code, but we still have to conform to the capacity requirements in allocating our washrooms based on male and female sexes, okay? So we still have to determine how many washrooms we need, or how many water closets, my apologies, how many water closets we need based on 50% of the population being male and 50% of the washrooms being female, or population being female. And once we've determined how many each sex needs, we combine those together, and that determines how many all gender washrooms we require. So that is it for washrooms and some of the technical requirements of the code. So now let's get into inclusive design. And this is thinking outside the boundaries of the code. And these are things that I've sat on a few accessibility panels and committee groups, and they've brought my attention to this. And I'm really in the mindset of the code, and I think in the terms of the language of the code and the black and white. But this was really eye-opening for me because it made me aware of some of the different opportunities we have to promote these spaces as accessible. So I just wanted to draw your attention to these. There isn't any necessarily design guidelines to support any of these. These are just good practice items that would facilitate a better environment for everybody in your spaces. So, adopting wayfinding signage. There are standards to support wayfinding signage, but wayfinding can go a really long way in a building. And if we can provide braille and tactile characters to associate direction throughout your buildings, that's quite helpful. So I always recommend wayfinding signage be promoted throughout our buildings. Through this panel, I learned that there was a person who used a white cane. And they said when they approached some of our, say, high-rise office buildings and they were going in to visit someone, they enter into this large marble lobby. And they rely on their hearing to navigate through their spaces. And with these marble lobbies, there's a lot of background noise. There is a lot of echoing throughout these spaces. They're high volume. These reflective surfaces bounce noises in all different directions. And simply by putting in a carpet runner that leads from the entrance door to the elevators or to the security desk will assist with wayfinding. It will allow them to understand this is the direction of travel I need to go. Because typically someone who uses a white cane is going to rely on their hearing sense to follow the crowd and follow the noise and listen for that elevator ding. But when you've got this lobby with all these reflective surfaces and sounds are bouncing from every which direction, that can create a lot of confusion. And again, we want to promote that dignity and independence. We don't want someone to have to ask for help. So if we can be mindful of some of the texturing of our surfaces and being mindful of those sounds, that's going to really help with people navigating through our spaces. Audible devices is another big thing, and we're seeing more promotion in our Ontario building codes and some of our standards to consider more audibility throughout our spaces. Think in terms of if you were to step onto an elevator and you, through the tactile or braille indicators, you can determine that you want this button for the third floor. So you press the third floor. This may be a 30-story building. And if you are navigating up, but say the elevator stops on the first floor, the doors open. You have no visual awareness that this is the third floor or the first floor. So how do you know to get off at your stop? So that's where an audible announcement saying level 1 or level 3 might be beneficial. But we can promote that throughout all of our spaces. We go to the mall. It's a very busy time of year, the Christmas holidays, and people are approaching those malls. And we have those mall maps. And going up to them, well, typically you type in on a digital screen where you're locating. And this assumes that someone has the visual capabilities to type in and even the dexterity to type in what store they're looking for. And then the mall map displays a path of travel. Well, if there was an audible component that would suggest walk 100 paces to the left, turn right, walk another 300 paces, and it'll be down the hall, or it'll be there on your left, that would be beneficial. So we want to consider those audible devices. We've also got to be mindful of people who have kind of those disabilities that are hidden, the ones that we don't see. And this can go to anybody. these low sensory rooms. These are really becoming more common in our office spaces, where these are kind of areas that you can retreat to, that's going to shut out the world, and it's going to allow you to decompress, relax, and perpetuate any of that stress or anxiety that you might be feeling. And these can benefit anybody. It's not necessarily someone who may have a disability. I mean, I myself would personally benefit, I think, from using some of these low sensory rooms. Think of it like a spa or a wellness room. These are something that we could also all benefit from in making our spaces more holistic and more inclusive. I also was walking through a space and I noticed that they had some artwork on a wall. And oftentimes when it's, a renowned piece of work, we'll see that the artist's name is mentioned underneath that art piece. Well, if we can provide that in our Braille characters, that's going to allow everybody to understand who the artist is, or maybe name the art piece, or in even better, provide a description, of what that art piece is, right? So those are ways we can improve our spaces. Color contrasting is another big thing. You'll notice in a lot of our accessibility standards, they speak to color contrasting. That's why our kind of truncated domes are often bright yellow, because we want to make sure that people who have reduced opportunity to see color, or maybe red-green colorblind even, have the opportunity to see these. So we want to be mindful of our color choices and look for those color contrasting spaces. And even navigating and wayfinding can be achieved through color contrasting. So these are all just things to think beyond the boundaries of the code, and things that we can do to better promote accessibility and inclusive design and make our spaces accessible for everybody. We are a very evolving world, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity here to make these spaces really inviting for everyone. And that is it for my presentation. So thank you, everybody. I hope that you've learned something through this presentation, and I am now available for questions. If everybody would like to start typing them, I will open up the Q&A here and see. We have 2 questions here, so I will read them out. Would CSA B651 be or is contemplated to be adopted as part of the OBC 2024 harmonization or in future versions? That is a great question. I have not heard that Ontario is going to be adopting B651. I think it would be good practice, because I feel that there are a lot of gaps in our current OBC, but I haven't heard that we will be adopting the B651 requirements for Ontario projects. Again, I caveat that there's nothing stopping you from designing to 651, provided it doesn't conflict with the building code. You are welcome to go above and beyond. Next question. Further to your 5-story addition above an existing building, I assume the same are true for egress requirements. So will the exit stairs need to be upgraded, say, for a penthouse addition, assuming more stringent requirements is required by code? Okay. This requirement is egress requirement. So this goes beyond barrier-free access. I speak to that in the sense that exit stairs and egress stairs are specifically exempt from providing a barrier-free path of travel. So there's no need to upgrade your exit stairs, but from a building code, because I answer building code questions as well. But from an exit stair, yes, obviously, if you're putting an addition on and you're making any impact to an existing building that's going to have an adverse effect, then you may have to do upgrades to that. So from an exit stair perspective, we consider flow rate, so we don't accumulate. So as long as you extend your stair up, you should be okay. But from a barrier-free perspective, this is not applicable, because we do not, exit stairs are not forming part of our barrier-free path of travel. And the next question is, all gender washroom will be like universal washroom? No, great question. An all gender washroom does not need to be accessible. I typically apply the same requirement. I treat my all gender washroom as if it were a stall. So I apply the requirements for stalls. So if I have a bank of washrooms, and say I have 3 all gender washrooms, and I have a universal washroom down the hall within 45 meters, I don't need to design that all gender washroom as an accessible stall, okay? However, if I have 6 or 7 all gender washrooms located side by side, then proportionally I would still apply that table. I think it was 3823B. I would still apply that table as if those all gender washroom stalls would require one of those stalls or 2 of those stalls to be designed to be accessible. So I may have my bank of 7, of which 2 are designed a little bit wider to accommodate the barrier-free washroom stall requirement. Okay. Next question. Does accessibility requirement applicable to service rooms that are accessed from grades? If you look at the definition of a barrier-free path of travel, I believe it exempts, I know it exempts specific rooms. So service rooms are exempt from barrier-free path of travel. So it's not necessary to design your service room to be accessible. And the idea is that maintenance personnel need to have a certain level of capability and dexterity to navigate through these service rooms. These are not occupied spaces. They are limited to maintenance personnel who are often going in there to make repairs and equipment. And there's a certain level of dexterity required to do those tasks. So these spaces do not need to be designed to be barrier-free accessible. What is a family washroom in a public space? Well, it's just a washroom. Whether it's a family, male, female, it doesn't matter. So we would consider that a washroom, right? And that washroom may consist of a single stall, right? We just have a toilet. And then that washroom we would look at, okay, well, if it's not accessible, we want to make sure that there's an accessible washroom within 45 meters, right? If there's no accessible washroom within 45 meters, then we want to ensure that we design this family washroom to be accessible. So that family washroom is really just a washroom. The naming of family has no bearing in terms of code. It's just a washroom that we want to make sure that we make it accessible to a full family, but it need not be barrier-free accessible if there is a barrier-free washroom within close proximity. Why the tactile for public ramp is at the bottom when I personally tripped and the tactile was at the top of the ramp? So I believe under the building code, there is no requirement to put a tactile attention indicator for ramps. Again, the idea is that your foot, when you're stepping, the transition is so small when you're navigating through a ramp, assuming your ramp is designed to code at 1 and 12. So there's not necessary to put that tactile attention indicator at the top of a ramp because the transition is so minor between those elevation changes. So I can't speak to why you tripped and why it was provided at the top or bottom, but that might have just been the owner or operator of the building was trying to go beyond the code and they wanted to put it in to identify that there is an elevational change to that ramp. Okay, well, got another question. Is it acceptable to have a barrier-free bathroom in common areas that does not have a transfer space similar to a barrier-free washroom in a suite? Barrier-free bathroom in common areas that does not have a transfer space, similar to a barrier-free. No. So the requirements for transfer space and barrier-free washrooms in a suite, when you say barrier-free washroom in a suite, I assume that you mean a residential suite. So I did have a graphic previously. And it didn't require the transfer suite because there's a certain familiarity when you're in your own home and you're in your own space. But if you're locating it in a common space, then that washroom has to be designed per the full requirements for a barrier-free washroom. So I believe the transfer space is under OBC Article 3838. And it does speak to if your washroom is provided or it's in excess, you must be designed to meet 3838, and that includes that transfer space. Whereas in a residential application, we don't apply 3838. It has its own requirements under those Group C residential application. Okay, any other questions? Oh, here we go. Will the OBC including the term visibility as part of section 3.8? This is the term that is becoming increasingly common in B651 and has major implications to the definition of barrier-free washrooms within suites. Oh, visitability. Sorry. So this is I haven't heard that term visibility. I'm assuming that's about access. This is a term that is becoming increasingly common in B651. It has major implications in definition of barrier-free washroom within suites. I'm not quite sure on what that question is, but if you are providing a barrier-free washroom, you want to ensure that it's accessible to all. So you want security devices, they can be put on it, but if it's within a suite, then you assume that everybody in that suite has that security card access. I'm not quite sure what this question relates to, so if you want to retype it in a different way, perhaps I can better address that for you. Next question. When we have a toilet in the middle of the washroom with a fold down grabber on both sides, where to put the paper towel dispenser? As the code mentions, paper towel dispenser is supposed to be 300 from the toilet. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I'm trying to think of how I've applied that. I believe typically we have a fold down grab bar usually on one side. I don't know if I've ever seen it on both sides, but then in that case, then I would recommend that it be pole mounted, right? Then we would pole mount it on the floor within 300 millimeters of the toilet. And again, just put yourself in that situation of a person who's using this toilet, who may not have the reach capabilities to, reach beyond the 300. We want to make sure that our toilet paper is within reach, right? Of obviously someone using that toilet. So then we may have to look at a pole mounted device that's going to allow us to have someone to reach it without actually navigating off of the toilet to do so. Any other questions? Looks like that might be it. Thank you, everyone. Those are great questions.
Yeah, great questions. And that was a really great presentation, Megan. Thank you so much. And I can see everyone was really engaged in the discussion. So great final webinar for 2024.
Yay.
And thank you so much for everyone on the call who attended and participated. It was really great.